Hey everyone. Since today is April 15th, 2015, it is the 150th anniversary of the death of Abraham Lincoln. So I figured I would use this occasion to share some of my thoughts concerning Lincoln's legacy, specifically whether he actually deserves credit for ending slavery in America. In recent decades, a lot of folks have become cynical about his role in ending slavery. They've said that he doesn't really deserve credit for it because his Emancipation Proclamation only applied to slaves in the states that had seceded from the Union, where he didn't have the power to do much about slavery at that point. And the proclamation left slavery alone in the territories that remained in the Union, the slave states that stayed in the Union, where Lincoln supposedly could have done something about it. But I think that that view is actually misguided and mistaken. Partly for reasons that I only recently discovered when I finally got around, within the last few months, to reading James McPherson's book, Battle Cry of Freedom, which is a great history of the Civil War for any of you who care. The thing that people, there's already been a lot of information out there about the practical and strategic situation that Lincoln faced. He couldn't afford to alienate public opinion in the border states that stayed in the Union because he would have risked seeing them secede and join the Confederacy as well if he had tried to interfere with slavery there. And that, of course, would have not only made the war a lot harder to win, but it would also have risked cutting off the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., from the rest of the Union, because, of course, D.C. is sandwiched between Maryland and Virginia. However, there's another factor that a lot of folks haven't considered. And I myself didn't consider this either until I read Mr. McPherson's book. One of the things he pointed out is that Lincoln's proclamation was framed as an executive order under his power as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. It was a military measure that aimed to deprive the Confederacy of one of its major war resources, namely the labor of its slaves. By this point, the Confederates were starting to put slaves to work in wartime industries to fuel their war machine. So Lincoln said, let me issue a proclamation that authorizes and commands Union troops in the field, whenever they start finally winning back large swaths of Confederate territory, to confiscate Confederate property that is being used to fuel the Confederate war machine, including slave property, right? So as a legal matter, that was the premise on which Lincoln rested the proclamation. That's how he justified it. It was a measure that he had the constitutional authority to pass unilaterally as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. He didn't need to get Congress involved or the state legislatures involved because he was at war with the Confederate States, and thus this was part of his prosecution of the war effort. However, he didn't have the power to do that with respect to slavery in the states that stayed in the Union. He wasn't at war with those states. And those states continued to be governed by the normal peacetime domestic laws of the United States, including the Constitution. And at that time, before the 13th Amendment was passed, the Constitution made slavery a matter of state jurisdiction. So even if Lincoln had been able to get Congress to go along at the time, which he couldn't at that point, he still couldn't have done anything about slavery in the slave states that stayed in the Union because it was not a matter of federal jurisdiction. Only the states could have abolished it one by one, and those slave states that stayed in the Union had no plans on to abolish slavery at that stage of the war. So when you look at it through that lens, you'll see that the Emancipation Proclamation actually made a lot more sense than it might appear to make at first blush. What's more, let's not forget, the proclamation had a practical impact. As news of the proclamation reached slaves on the southern plantations, it gave them unprecedented hope for successfully escaping. And of course, Lincoln's prosecution of the war drew a lot of Confederate manpower away from the plantations so that they were less able than ever to keep an eye on the slaves and prevent them from escaping. So slaves began fleeing the plantations in droves, in record numbers that had never been seen before. And there wasn't that much the Confederate forces could do about it because they were busy, they had their hands full fighting the Union Army on the battlefield. So both Lincoln's prosecution of the war and the Emancipation Proclamation really helped make the collapse of slavery happen even before the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, which of course brought a legal end to the institution of slavery in America. So I think Lincoln actually still deserves a lot of the credit for the end of slavery. I think it is simplistic to say, as generations of American school children have learned, that Lincoln freed the slaves. That makes it sound as if he did it all by his lonesome. Obviously, that's not the case. And yes, the slaves deserve a great deal of the credit themselves for participating in the process of their own emancipation by seizing the opportunity, striking while the iron was hot, and running away from the plantations at the first opportunity. But let's not forget that Lincoln's prosecution of the war helped create that opportunity and make that collapse of slavery possible, to the point where it wasn't possible as a practical matter to revive it after the war, even if most folks had still been inclined to leave it alone and leave things be. So for those reasons, I think that we should still acknowledge Lincoln as a but-for cause of the end of slavery in America. And we should also acknowledge the lesson that doing the right thing isn't always easy, and it's definitely not always simple. Sometimes you have to take very complicated and roundabout routes to get to those just outcomes, especially through the fog of war. So that's my take on this subject, and by all means, share your feedback with me. Agree, disagree, approve, disapprove. I look forward to the conversation, as always. Peace out.